How Humans Outsmarted the Shapeshifting Invasion. The survey ship Proteus drifted through the void between stars, its hull gleaming silver against the cosmic darkness. Dr. Elizabeth Ward pressed her palm against the observation deck's reinforced viewport, watching distant nebulae paint the blackness in ethereal purples and blues. 3 years into their deep space mission, the crew had cataloged 17 new worlds and made first contact with 4 previously unknown species. Yet something felt wrong today, a subtle wrongness that made her skin crawl. Another sleepless night, Doc. Security Chief Marcus Johnson's voice carried that familiar gravelly tone as he approached, coffee mug steaming in his weathered hands. Elizabeth turned, studying his face with the practiced eye of a xenobiologist who'd spent years reading alien expressions. Marcus looked tired, but then again, he always looked tired. The perpetual furrow between his brows, the way his left shoulder drooped slightly from an old injury, the unconscious habit of tapping his index finger against his thigh when thinking, all perfectly normal. All perfectly Marcus. Just thinking about the Kepler 442 samples, she replied, though that wasn't entirely true. Something had been nagging at her consciousness for days, like a half-remembered dream that danced just beyond recall. Marcus nodded, sipping his coffee. The crystalline formations, fascinating stuff, though I'll admit most of it goes over my head. He paused, studying her expression. You sure that's all? You've seemed distracted lately. Before Elizabeth could respond, the ship's intercom crackled to life. All senior staff to the bridge, Priority Alpha. Captain Harrison's voice carried an edge that made both officers exchange glances. The bridge buzzed with controlled tension when they arrived. Captain Harrison stood before the main view screen, his usually immaculate uniform slightly rumpled. Navigation Officer Chen worked frantically at her console, while Communications Specialist Torres monitored incoming signals with unusual intensity. Report, Marcus said, automatically shifting into security mode. We've detected an unidentified vessel approximately 2 million kilometers off our starboard bow, Harrison announced. It appeared on sensors 30 minutes ago, no energy signature, no response to hails, it's just there. Elizabeth moved to the science station, her fingers dancing across the holographic interface. Scanning for life signs. That's odd. I'm reading multiple biosignatures, but they're fluctuating, almost like they're changing. Changing how? Marcus stepped closer, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. The cellular patterns keep shifting. I've never seen anything like it. It's as if the life forms aboard that vessel are constantly altering their biological structure. A new voice cut through the bridge chatter, smooth, melodious, and utterly alien. Greetings, humans of the vessel Proteus. We are the Mor'phic. We come seeking understanding. The view screen flickered, revealing a sleek, organic-looking ship that seemed to pulse with bioluminescent patterns. Standing in what appeared to be their bridge was a figure that defied easy description, tall, graceful, with features that seemed to flow like liquid mercury. Its form was vaguely humanoid, but possessed an otherworldly beauty that made Elizabeth's breath catch. I am Shape Master Fluxara, the being continued. We have traveled far to meet your species. Your reputation for adaptability precedes you. Captain Harrison stepped forward. Welcome, Shape Master. I'm Captain Harrison of the Earth Survey Corps. We're honored by this first contact. Elizabeth found herself studying Fluxara intently, her scientific mind cataloging every detail. The being's form seemed stable now, but she could swear she'd seen subtle shifts in its facial structure during the brief conversation. The way it held itself, the cadence of its speech, everything suggested a species that existed in constant flux. We request permission to send a cultural exchange delegation to your vessel, Fluxara said. 3 of our kind, to learn your ways as you might learn ours. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Captain, protocol suggests. Granted, Harrison interrupted. We'll prepare quarters for your delegation. As the transmission ended, Elizabeth felt that nagging sensation intensify. Something about this encounter felt orchestrated, too convenient. But she pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the unprecedented opportunity to study a shape-shifting species. The docking bay hummed with activity as the crew prepared for their visitors. Elizabeth stood beside Marcus, both wearing their dress uniforms for the formal reception. The Mor'phic shuttle was unlike anything in human design, a living thing that seemed to breathe as it settled onto the deck. 3 figures emerged from the craft, each one a study in alien grace. They appeared humanoid but possessed an ethereal quality that made them seem almost too perfect. The lead figure, who introduced itself as Scholar Vextai, bore a striking resemblance to classical depictions of angels, tall, luminous, with features that seemed carved from marble. The second, Warrior Kethrin, possessed a more imposing presence, broader shoulders, more angular features, with eyes that seemed to hold depths of ancient knowledge. The third, Healer Nyxara, appeared the most human-like of the group, with gentle features and an aura of calm that immediately put the crew at ease. "Welcome aboard the Proteus," Captain Harrison said, extending his hand in the traditional human greeting. Scholar Vextai studied the gesture for a moment before reciprocating, its grip firm but somehow wrong, too perfect, lacking the subtle imperfections that made human contact feel natural. Over the following days, the Mor'phic delegates integrated themselves into ship life with remarkable ease. They attended briefings, participated in cultural exchanges, and demonstrated their shape-shifting abilities in controlled scientific demonstrations that left Elizabeth both fascinated and unsettled. It was during one such demonstration that she first noticed the discrepancy. "Fascinating," she murmured, watching as Scholar Vextai shifted from its default form into a perfect replica of Navigation Officer Chen. Every detail was flawless: the slight scar above Chen's left eyebrow, the way her hair fell across her forehead, even the small mole on her neck that was barely visible unless you knew to look for it. But when the transformed Vextai spoke, something was off. The words were Chen's, the voice identical, but the cadence was wrong. Chen had a habit of pausing mid-sentence when calculating navigation coordinates, a tiny quirk born from years of double-checking her work. The duplicate spoke with perfect fluency, lacking that characteristic hesitation. "Remarkable mimicry," Elizabeth said carefully, making notes on her tablet. "How do you achieve such perfect physical replication?" "We study," Vextai replied, shifting back to its original form. "We observe, we become." "But surely there are limitations. Memories, personal experiences, learned behaviors." Something flickered across Vextai's features, too quick to be certain, but Elizabeth could have sworn she saw annoyance. Physical form is all that matters. Behavior can be approximated. That night, Elizabeth found herself unable to sleep. She wandered the ship's corridors, her mind churning with observations and half-formed theories. The Mor'phic were impressive, certainly, but their understanding of mimicry seemed oddly limited. They could copy appearance perfectly but seemed to view behavior as secondary, almost irrelevant. She paused outside the mess hall, hearing voices within. Through the partially open door, she could see Healer Nyxara sitting with several crew members, apparently sharing stories about Mor'phic culture. But something about the scene felt wrong. Nyxara was laughing at Engineer Rodriguez's joke about quantum mechanics, but the laugh was too loud, too long. Rodriguez had a dry sense of humor that typically elicited chuckles, not guffaws. More importantly, the joke required an understanding of human cultural context that an alien, no matter how intelligent, shouldn't possess after only a few days of contact. Elizabeth's pulse quickened as she observed more carefully. Nyxara's posture was perfect, relaxed, friendly, engaged, but it lacked the subtle variations that made human body language feel natural. It was like watching an actor who'd memorized their blocking but forgotten to inhabit the character. The next morning brought a new crisis. Communications specialist Tors failed to report for his shift, and a search of his quarters revealed signs of a struggle: overturned furniture, scattered personal belongings, and most disturbing of all, traces of an unknown biological substance that seemed to shift and flow when examined. "I want a full security sweep of the ship," Marcus ordered, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Something's happened to Tors." Elizabeth studied the biological samples under her microscope, her worst fears beginning to crystallize. The substance exhibited properties consistent with Mor'phic cellular structure, the same constant flux she'd observed in their initial scans of the alien vessel. "Marcus," she called, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think we have a problem." He joined her at the science station, studying the microscopic images she'd captured. "What am I looking at?" "Morphic tissue, fresh, and unless I'm very much mistaken, it was left behind during a transformation." The implications hung heavy between them. If a Morphic had transformed in Tors' quarters, and Tors was missing. "We need to find him," Marcus said grimly, "and we need to figure out which of our guests isn't who they claim to be." But as they began their investigation, Elizabeth realized the situation was far worse than they'd imagined. Over the next several hours, a pattern emerged that chilled her to the bone. Crew members were behaving strangely, subtle changes that might go unnoticed individually, but formed a disturbing picture when viewed collectively. Chief Engineer Rodriguez, normally meticulous about safety protocols, had bypassed 3 standard procedures during his morning maintenance routine. Dr. Sarah Kim from the medical bay had prescribed medications using dosages that were technically correct but deviated from her usual conservative approach. Even Captain Harrison seemed different, more decisive perhaps, but lacking the thoughtful deliberation that characterized his leadership style. "It's not just Tors," Elizabeth told Marcus as they huddled in a secure storage compartment, speaking in whispers. "I think multiple crew members have been replaced." Marcus's face darkened. "How many?" "I can't be sure. The changes are subtle, but they're there. It's like watching people who look exactly like our crew but don't quite know how to be them." "What do you mean?" Elizabeth pulled up her tablet, showing him the notes she'd been compiling. "Human behavior isn't just about appearance or even speech patterns. It's about 1,000 tiny details. The way someone holds their coffee cup, how they respond to stress, their personal quirks and habits. The Morphic can copy the physical perfectly, but they're missing the psychological complexity." "So how do we identify them?" "We test them, not with questions about facts, those could be learned. We test them with situations that require intuitive human responses." They spent the next hour developing a plan, using Elizabeth's understanding of human psychology and Marcus's knowledge of crew behavior patterns. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity: create scenarios that would force the imposters to reveal themselves through behavioral inconsistencies. The senior staff meeting was called for 1400 hours, ostensibly to discuss the search for Tors. Elizabeth and Marcus had carefully orchestrated every detail, creating what appeared to be a routine briefing, but was actually an elaborate psychological trap. Captain Harrison, or the being wearing his face, called the meeting to order with his usual efficiency. But Elizabeth noticed immediately that he sat differently, his posture too rigid, lacking the slight forward lean that characterized the real Harrison's engaged listening style. "Before we begin," Elizabeth announced, "I'd like to share some personal news. My sister back on Earth just had her first child, a beautiful baby girl named Sarah." She watched the faces around the table carefully. The real crew members would know she was an only child, a fact she'd mentioned numerous times during their 3-year mission. Dr. Kim, the real Dr. Kim, would have immediately called out the inconsistency with a gentle tease about Elizabeth's fictional family. Instead, the woman wearing Kim's face smiled warmly and said, "Congratulations. You must be so excited to be an aunt." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. Strike one. Marcus picked up the next phase of their plan. Speaking of family, I got a message from my ex-wife yesterday. Apparently, our son made the varsity football team. Again, Elizabeth watched the reactions. Marcus had never been married and had no children, another fact well known to the crew. Chief Engineer Rodriguez would typically respond with a sarcastic comment about Marcus being too ugly to find a wife, a running joke between the two men. Instead, the figure wearing Rodriguez's face nodded approvingly. "That's wonderful news, Marcus. You must be very proud." Strike two. The pattern continued throughout the meeting. Each carefully crafted lie was accepted without question by certain crew members, while others, the ones Elizabeth was increasingly certain, were genuine, looked confused or concerned by the false information. By the meeting's end, Elizabeth had identified at least 6 potential imposters, including Captain Harrison himself. The scope of the infiltration was staggering. The Mor'phic had replaced nearly half the senior staff. That evening, Elizabeth and Marcus met with the crew members they were confident remained genuine. The group was smaller than they'd hoped, only 8 people out of a crew of 37. "This is insane," whispered Navigation Officer Chen, her face pale with shock. "How long have they been replacing us?" "Based on the pattern of behavioral changes, I'd estimate they started 3 days ago," Elizabeth replied, "right after their delegation came aboard." "But why?" asked Dr. Patel from the geology department. "What do they want?" Marcus's expression was grim. "Information. Ship schematics, crew protocols, maybe even the location of Earth. This wasn't a cultural exchange, it was a reconnaissance mission." "So what do we do?" Chen asked. Elizabeth had been thinking about that question for hours. "We expose them, but we have to be smart about it. They have the advantage of numbers, and we don't know what happened to the real crew members they replaced." "You think they're still alive?" Dr. Patel's voice carried desperate hope. "I think the Mor'phic are too curious about human biology to simply kill their subjects," Elizabeth said. "They're probably being held somewhere, studied, which means we might be able to save them if we act quickly." They spent the next several hours planning their counterattack. The strategy was risky, but elegant, used the Morphic's own overconfidence against them by exploiting their fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. The trap was sprung during the next day's shift change. Elizabeth had programmed the ship's computer to announce a false emergency, a containment breach in the xenobiology lab that required immediate evacuation of Deck 7. It was the kind of crisis that would trigger specific, well-rehearsed responses from the crew. The genuine crew members reacted exactly as expected. Dr. Kim immediately headed for the medical bay to prepare for potential casualties, while Chief Rodriguez moved toward the engineering section to monitor containment systems. Their responses were automatic, born from years of training and experience. The imposters, however, hesitated. They knew the procedures intellectually but lacked the muscle memory that made human responses feel natural. In that moment of hesitation, they revealed themselves. "Now," Marcus shouted, and the loyal crew members sprang into action. The confrontation was swift but chaotic. The Mor'phic, realizing their deception had been discovered, abandoned their human forms and revealed their true nature. They were beautiful in an alien way, flowing, shifting beings of living mercury that could reshape themselves at will. But their shape-shifting abilities, so effective for infiltration, proved less useful in direct combat. Marcus and his security team had prepared for this possibility, using sonic disruptors that interfered with the Morphic's cellular cohesion. The being that had been impersonating Captain Harrison writhed under the sonic assault, its form becoming unstable. "You cannot comprehend our purpose," it gasped, its voice distorting as its vocal cords shifted. "Try us," Elizabeth replied, adjusting the disruptor's frequency to cause maximum disruption without permanent damage. With the imposters subdued, the real work began. Elizabeth and her team used the sonic disruptors to force the Mor'phic to reveal the location of the missing crew members. They were found in a hidden compartment aboard the alien vessel, alive but unconscious, their bodies bearing signs of extensive biological scanning. As the crew recovered, the true scope of the Mor'phic plan became clear. They had successfully infiltrated dozens of species using the same basic strategy, perfect physical mimicry, combined with basic behavioral observation. For most species, appearance was indeed the primary factor in recognition. "You don't understand," Scholar Vexti said as Elizabeth questioned it in the brig. "We have done this countless times. Physical form is identity, behavior is irrelevant." "Not for humans," Elizabeth replied. "We're social creatures. We recognize each other through a complex web of behavioral patterns, emotional responses, and shared experiences. You can copy our bodies perfectly, but you can't copy our souls." The Mor'phic seemed genuinely puzzled by this concept. Their own society, Elizabeth learned, was based entirely on physical transformation. Identity was fluid, changeable, defined by form rather than personality or experience. "Your species is anomalous," Fluxara admitted when brought aboard the Proteus for formal negotiations. "We have studied your records, your cultural transmissions. We believed we understood your nature." "You understood our appearance," Marcus corrected, "but you missed everything that makes us human." The negotiations that followed were tense but productive. The Mor'phic, faced with the complete failure of their infiltration strategy, were forced to acknowledge that humans possessed a complexity they hadn't anticipated. Some of their number, particularly the younger ones, seemed genuinely curious about this discovery. But not all were willing to accept defeat gracefully. The attack came without warning. A faction of Mor'phic warriors, led by warrior Kethryn, had decided that if infiltration was impossible, direct assault was the only option. They had been monitoring the negotiations from their ship, growing increasingly agitated as their fundamental worldview was challenged. The first sign of trouble was when the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in moments later, bathing the ship in red light, but the damage was done. In the confusion of the blackout, several Mor'phic had managed to escape their containment and were now loose aboard the ship. "All hands, this is Security Chief Johnson," Marcus's voice echoed through the corridors. "We have hostile shapeshifters aboard. Trust no one unless you can verify their identity through behavioral confirmation." Elizabeth found herself trapped in the xenobiology lab with Dr. Patel when the attack began. They could hear sounds of conflict echoing through the ship energy weapon discharges, shouting, the distinctive whine of sonic disruptors. "How do we know if someone's real?" Dr. Patel asked, his voice shaking. "Ask them something only they would know," Elizabeth replied, checking the lab's security systems. "But more importantly, watch how they respond. The Mor'phic can fake knowledge, but they can't fake personality." As if summoned by her words, the lab door slid open to reveal Captain Harrison. He looked disheveled but unharmed, his uniform torn and his face grim. "Thank God you're safe," he said, moving toward them. "We need to get to the bridge. Marcus has a plan to." Elizabeth held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Something was wrong. Harrison looked perfect, every detail correct, from the small scar on his chin to the way his hair fell across his forehead. But his eyes were wrong. They held none of the warmth that characterized the real Harrison, none of the paternal concern he showed for his crew. "What's my favorite coffee blend?" she asked suddenly. "Jamaican Blue Mountain," he replied without hesitation. "You drink it every morning at 6:30. The answer was correct, but Elizabeth's heart sank. The real Harrison would have asked why she was testing him, would have shown concern about her suspicious behavior. This version simply provided the requested information with mechanical precision. "Dr. Patel," she said quietly, "run." The false Harrison's expression shifted, becoming predatory. "Clever little human, but not clever enough. The transformation was horrifying to witness. Harrison's familiar features melted away like wax, revealing the flowing, mercury-like form of a Mor'phic warrior. But this one was different from the others, larger, more aggressive, with appendages that shifted into weapon-like configurations. Elizabeth grabbed a sonic disruptor from the lab's emergency kit, but the warrior was faster. A pseudopod lashed out, striking her wrist and sending the weapon flying across the room. "Your species has caused us great difficulty," the warrior hissed, its voice a disturbing amalgamation of sounds. "We came in peace, seeking only information, but you have forced us to violence." "You came as spies and kidnappers," Elizabeth shot back, backing toward the lab's secondary exit. "Don't pretend this is our fault." The warrior flowed forward, its form shifting to block her escape route. "Your behavioral complexity is an anomaly. It will be studied. You will be studied." Before it could reach her, the lab door exploded inward. Marcus burst through, flanked by 2 security officers, all carrying military-grade sonic disruptors. "Get away from her," he shouted, opening fire. The warrior writhed under the sonic assault, its form becoming unstable. But instead of surrendering, it did something Elizabeth had never seen a Mor'phic do before. It began to glow with an internal light, its cellular structure becoming increasingly chaotic. "It's destabilizing itself," she shouted. "Everyone out." They barely made it to the corridor before the lab erupted in a burst of bioluminescent energy. The warrior had chosen self-destruction rather than capture, taking half the xenobiology section with it. The battle for the Proteus lasted 6 hours. When it was over, 3 Mor'phic warriors lay dead, victims of their own inability to understand that humans would fight with desperate creativity when cornered. The survivors, led by Scholar Vextai, finally agreed to genuine negotiations. "We underestimated your species," Vextai admitted as the formal peace talks began. "We believed that all intelligent life followed the same patterns we had observed in others." "And what patterns are those?" Captain Harrison asked. He bore the scars of the battle, a bandaged arm where a Mor'phic weapon had grazed him, and a haunted look in his eyes from seeing his own face worn by an enemy. "Form equals identity," Vextai replied. "In every species we have encountered, recognition is based primarily on physical appearance. Behavior is secondary, learned, changeable. But humans—" It paused, its form shifting slightly as if struggling with the concept. "Humans seem to define identity through behavior itself." Elizabeth nodded. "We're social creatures. We evolved in groups where survival depended on understanding not just what someone looked like, but who they were inside. A human can change their appearance dramatically and still be recognized by those who know them well. This makes infiltration difficult," another Mor'phic observed. "Impossible," Marcus corrected firmly. "At least against humans who know each other well. You might fool strangers, but you'll never fool friends." The negotiations continued for days, establishing new protocols for contact between their species. The Mor'phic agreed to abandon their infiltration tactics in exchange for formal diplomatic relations and limited cultural exchange. But the most significant outcome was the change in Mor'phic society itself. The younger generation, led by beings like Scholar Vextai, began to question their species' fundamental assumptions about identity and behavior. "Perhaps," Vextai said during one of their final conversations, "there is more to existence than the ability to change form. Perhaps identity itself is more complex than we believed." Elizabeth smiled. "That's the beginning of wisdom, understanding that there's always more to learn." 6 months later, the Proteus continued its survey mission, but with a new understanding of the universe's complexity. The encounter with the Mor'phic had taught them that intelligence could take forms they'd never imagined, and that their own humanity, their behavioral complexity, their social bonds, their intuitive understanding of each other was not a weakness but a strength. Dr. Elizabeth Ward stood once again at the observation deck's viewport, watching the stars wheel by. But this time, she wasn't alone. Marcus stood beside her, along with several other crew members who had become closer friends after surviving the crisis together. "Penny for your thoughts?" Marcus asked, using the old Earth expression that had become something of a running joke between them. "Just thinking about identity," Elizabeth replied, "about what makes us who we are." "And what conclusion have you reached?" She smiled, watching the distant stars. "That we're more than the sum of our parts, more than our appearance, more than our knowledge, more than any single aspect of ourselves. We're the patterns we create, the relationships we build, the way we respond to the unexpected." "Very philosophical for a scientist," Marcus teased. "Science is philosophy," she replied. "It's the attempt to understand the universe and our place in it. The Mor'phic taught us that our place is unique, not because we're superior, but because we're different. Our complexity isn't a bug, it's a feature." Behind them, the ship hummed with activity as the crew went about their duties. Each person moved with their own distinctive patterns, their own behavioral signatures that made them uniquely themselves. It was a symphony of humanity that no amount of shapeshifting could replicate. In the depths of space, the Proteus sailed on, carrying its crew of irreplaceable individuals toward whatever wonders awaited among the stars. And if they encountered other species who sought to deceive or infiltrate, they would be ready, not with weapons or technology, but with the most human trait of all, the ability to truly see each other for who they really were. The universe was vast and full of mysteries, but humanity had learned something valuable from their encounter with the Mor'phic. Sometimes, the greatest strength wasn't the ability to become someone else. It was the courage to remain yourself. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing for more journeys. Share your thoughts in the comments and stay tuned for the next adventure.